The story begins with a wide piece of land that looked quiet and calm in the daylight, yet carried a strange heaviness in the air. And the people in the town always avoided walking across it after sunset because they felt the ground was breathing under their feet, and sometimes a low humming sound rose from the soil, like something old was sleeping deep inside, but they never dared to talk about it loudly and only whispered in fear when no one was listening. This land belonged to a woman named Eleanor, a tall black woman with silver hair tied in a long braid, her back straight, as if the weight of years never bent her, and her eyes glowing sharp, like someone who had seen too much pain and too many secrets. She lived alone in a wooden house at the edge of the property, and whenever people passed by, she sat quietly on her porch, rocking in an old chair, holding a cane carved with strange markings. For decades, no one touched her land because they knew it had history, and her ancestors had worked on it, had fought for it, had bled for it, and she protected it like a lioness guarding cubs. But times changed, and the Homeowners Association, also known as HOA, came with lawyers and builders and papers claiming ownership, saying Eleanor had no right to stop progress, and they would raise houses, build roads, and turn her soil into a shining neighborhood with swimming pools and shopping centers. Had stood firm, her voice deep and steady, she warned them all, saying, "You cannot build here. This land remembers, and it will not forgive." But the HOA board members only laughed at her words. Thinking she was just an old woman with silly stories, they ignored her warnings. They called her stubborn and superstitious, and they moved forward, with heavy machines cutting trees, flattening the ground, and pouring foundations without care of what lay underneath. She watched in silence. Each day the machines roared and the men hammered steel and concrete into the earth, and at night she sat by her window, listening to the ground moaning like it was alive and angry. And when the first walls rose, she whispered to herself, saying, "They have started the chain, and soon they will finish it. And then the land will speak louder than Maine less." Then a year 96 homes stood tall and proud, rows of shining houses with bright paint-polished fences and perfect gardens. The HOA called it the crown of the community, a dream place for families. But the truth was darker, because every nail and every stone had awakened something, and every foundation had pressed against bones that were never meant to be. Disturbed on the opening ceremony, the HOA leaders gathered with smiling families. Balloons floated in the air, children laughed, music played from speakers, and cameras flashed as they cut the ribbon, announcing the birth of a new modern neighborhood. But in that very moment, the ground shook under their feet, lightly at first, then stronger, rattling glasses, making some children cry, and silencing the music. Speakers crackled with static, as if electricity itself was afraid. Everyone looked around nervously, but the HOA chairman laughed, raising his hand, saying, "It is only the ground settling, nothing to worry about," and people forced themselves to clap again and cheer. But Eleanor stood at the edge, watching her braid shining in the sunlight, her cane pressing into the earth. She shook her head slowly, and her lips curled into a whisper that no one wanted to hear. She said, "Now they will learn." As night came, the families moved into their new homes. They decorated rooms, cooked dinners, and tried to ignore the strange feeling that their footsteps echoed too loudly against the walls, and the floors seemed to breathe softly, like a chest rising and falling while asleep. Some of them thought it was their imagination, but when the wind passed through the neighborhood, it carried not only the sound of leaves, but also a faint noise like chains dragging through the soil. Dogs barked without reason. Children woke crying, saying they heard whispers outside the windows, and the grown-ups tried to calm them, saying it was only the wind. Yet the fear grew silently, and the old woman Eleanor sat alone on her porch, staring at the glowing windows of the 96 houses, her eyes sharp and unblinking, her whisper floating in the darkness, saying, "The trap is set, and the doors are waiting to open." The first week inside the new homes was filled with excitement and pride, and every family tried to show their friends and relatives that they were now part of a shining neighborhood with wide streets, green lawns, and clean walls. And the HOA leaders walked with confidence, thinking they had created a perfect image of wealth and progress. Yet behind the smiles, small shadows had already begun to grow. One night, a man named Carter walked into his backyard carrying a shovel. He wanted to plant a tree for his children, a symbol of new life and a new home. And as he pushed the shovel, Into the soil, he felt the ground resist in a strange way, like something was blocking him underneath. He pushed harder, and the metal rang against iron, making a dull echo that chilled his bones. Bent down, brushing away the dirt with his hands, and found the edge of a heavy door made of rusted black iron covered with strange carvings that looked older than the town itself. He called his wife, but when she came, she only shivered and begged him to leave it alone, saying it must be part of some old storm shelter. But Carter could not stop staring at the symbols, for they seemed to shift slightly in the moonlight. As if alive, he covered the door again with soil, promising himself to dig later. Yet that night he dreamed of voices chanting in a tongue he did not know, and when he woke his bed was damp with sweat. Other houses too began to show signs. The walls cracked in thin lines, though they were new. The windows rattled, though the air was still, and the lights flickered at strange hours. The people blamed the construction company or the power supply, but Eleanor, who sat quietly on her porch each evening, knew the reason, and her eyes followed every house as if counting silently 1, 2, 3 until 96 children in the neighborhood began to complain of nightmares. They drew pictures with crayons, not of happy houses or flowers, but of tall shadow men with chains instead of arms and hollow eyes that glowed red. Some parents laughed nervously, saying children have wild imagination, but when the same drawings appeared in several houses with no contact between the kids, the laughter turned uneasy. A young woman named Mariah returned home one evening carrying groceries, and as she reached for her keys, she felt the door handle turn by itself. Slowly she froze, staring, but when she pushed the door open, the house was empty. She called her husband and told him what happened, but he only told her. She was tired and imagining things still. She refused to stay alone at night, and always kept candles burning in every room. The HOA members held a private meeting in the community hall, discussing the complaints they received: broken glass water pipes, strange noises, and residents who said they could not sleep properly. The chairman dismissed it all, saying these were teething problems in a new development. But another member whispered nervously that she had seen Eleanor watching the houses every night as if she was waiting for something. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat on her porch, her cane tapping against the floor in a slow rhythm, and her lips moving in words only she could hear. She remembered the promise of her grandmother, who told her that the land was guarded and that intruders would awaken the restless. Once she felt the ground tremble gently under her chair and smiled faintly, whispering, "They will understand soon." On the third week, the first true terror arrived. A boy named Daniel ran screaming from his bedroom in the middle of the night. His parents rushed to him and he cried, saying a man with chains had crawled from under his bed and tried to grab his legs. The father searched the room and found nothing, but when he looked at the floor he saw thin marks like burned lines shaped exactly like chain links. The story spread quickly across the homes. Fear grew thicker than smoke. People whispered in the streets, yet no one dared leave, for every attempt to drive out ended. The same cars would not start, engines failed, and those who tried walking found the roads twisting back, leading them to the same house they left. Eleanor watched and waited, her voice calm and strong as she whispered, "The doors are opening one by one, and soon they will all see what they chose to ignore." The days passed heavy with unease, and though the sun still shone bright upon the new houses, the people felt darkness in their hearts. For every night strange sounds echoed across the streets, and whispers rolled through the walls, and the children cried with the same words that the chained men had returned. And the parents tried to smile, but their voices cracked and their eyes darted nervously, as if expecting shadows at every turn. It was during this time that a group of residents decided to confront Eleanor, hoping the old woman would explain what was happening, because many of them remembered her warnings before the neighborhood was built, and they now feared she had known the truth. All along they marched together to her wooden house, though fear made their feet heavy and their voices weak. And when they reached her porch, she sat in her rocking chair as always, her silver braid hanging over her shoulder and her cane resting across her lap. One man stepped forward. His name was Patrick, and he asked why these things were happening, what was wrong with the land, and why she had not spoken clearer. Eleanor looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her face, and she said in a voice deep as thunder, "You were warned. This land carries the weight of blood and betrayal, and yet you chose to build your pride on it. Now you see the chains." People begged her to explain more, and she nodded slowly, tapping her cane against the porch, in a rhythm that made the ground seem to respond, and she began to speak of her grandmother, who once told her the full story of the land. She said long before the neighborhood and long before the town, there was a plantation here, owned by cruel masters who whipped and starved her ancestors, and forced them to build walls and dig pits and carry iron chains heavier than their own bodies, Eleanor. This voice grew stronger as she told them that one night 96 men were chained together and forced to dig deep beneath the soil, but the masters never freed them. They sealed the iron doors and left them to die in darkness, and their cries shook the ground until silence fell and the land took them as its own. But before their last breaths, they swore an oath that no thief and no trespasser would ever rest easy here. The residents listened, their faces pale, and their hearts racing, for the number 96 was the same as the number of homes built by the HOA. They realized that the houses stood exactly above the old pits, each foundation resting on the bones of men who had been wronged and betrayed, and Eleanor leaned forward, saying, "The land remembers. It always remembers." Patrick tried to argue, saying that curses are only stories, but another woman named Sheila cried out that her son had drawn pictures of chained men without ever hearing these tales, and she showed the drawings to Eleanor, who only nodded, saying, "The children see more clearly than the blind hearts of their parents, and the curse has already begun to rise." That night after the meeting, the people returned to their homes in silence, no longer daring to mock the old woman or laugh at her words, but the fear did not fade. Instead, it spread deeper, like roots under the soil, and many dreamed of footsteps and chains and voices calling their names from below the ground. Eleanor stayed awake, staring at the stars, her lips moving in prayer to her ancestors. She asked them to guide the innocent and punish only the guilty, but she knew the curse was not gentle. It was old and heavy, and it did not choose between sinner and saint. It only obeyed the law of betrayal and intrusion, and in her heart she wondered if the residents would find mercy, or if the land would swallow them all by the next morning. Cracks widened on several houses, and one man discovered that his living room floor had sunk by an inch, as if the house was slowly being pulled down into the earth. The HOA leaders again tried to silence the panic, but even their voices shook as they remembered Eleanor's story, and one by one they too began to wonder if the land was closing its trap tighter with every passing night. And in the quiet before dawn, Eleanor whispered to the wind that the forgotten history was awake again, and that the oath of the 96 was now unfolding, and no one could escape the memory of chains. Fear in the neighborhood had grown heavier than the air before a storm, and though people still tried to smile in the daylight, they no longer trusted the nights, because the nights carried whispers, dragging sounds, and shadows that lingered longer than they should have, and every family felt that their houses were not homes anymore, but cages built upon restless graves. It was first noticed by a family named the Harpers, who tried to drive out one early morning after another sleepless night. Their car started fine inside the garage, but the moment they rolled toward the main road, the engine coughed and died. They tried again and again until smoke rose from the hood, and the father cursed and stepped outside, only to find that the road itself looked unfamiliar, though they had driven it 100 times before. They walked for hours thinking they would reach the town, yet every turn bent them back to the same street where their own house stood, waiting like a silent sentinel. The children cried, saying the road was playing tricks, and when they looked at the navigation device, it spun wildly, showing no direction, as if the world outside had been harassed. Their family soon discovered the same trap engine's failed wheels refused to roll, and those who walked long paths found themselves circling back to their own homes again and again, like mice in a maze without end. Panic grew thicker, and many whispered that the neighborhood was no longer part of the world, but trapped inside a living prison. At night the terror deepened. Children woke screaming about men in chains standing at their windows. The drawings became darker and more detailed, showing figures with twisted mouths and burning eyes, and one child drew not only men but houses themselves wrapped in chains, as if the very buildings were being bound. The HOA board tried to calm the residents, but their own members had vanished. 2 of them had gone to speak with Eleanor, demanding answers, yet they never returned. Their houses stood empty, their cars untouched, and their families wept in fear, but no authority from outside could be called for. The phones rang only with static whenever someone tried to dial beyond the neighborhood in desperation. Some residents gathered in the community hall one evening, candles flickering shadows across frightened faces, and they argued about what to do. Some demanded they break into Eleanor's house and force her to stop the curse. Others said they should dig up the iron doors and destroy whatever lay beneath, but older voices trembled, saying that to disturb the ground further would only make the spirits rise stronger. While the people fought among themselves, Eleanor sat calmly on her porch, watching the hall glowing with candlelight, her cane tapping softly against the wood in a slow rhythm that echoed faintly through the earth. She whispered that the trap had already closed, and the more they struggled, the tighter it would hold. That same night, a woman named Gloria returned home late, and as she stepped inside her living room, she found the walls covered in wet handprints. Though no one else was inside, she screamed and ran to her neighbors, but when they returned with her, the handprints had vanished, leaving only the faint smell of iron and damp soil hanging in the air. One by one, the families began to realize they were not only trapped but watched, for no matter how tightly they locked their doors or closed their curtains, they felt eyes inside their homes, breathing behind their walls and moving beneath their floors. And when silence came, it was worse than noise, because silence meant the chains were waiting. Children became the true messengers of terror. They spoke of shadow men whispering their names, promising to take them below, and some parents tried to leave candles burning through the night, but the flames bent sideways as if pushed by unseen breath, and the wax melted faster than fire should melt. The neighborhood that once shone like a crown of progress had turned into a nightmare kingdom, where streets looped endlessly and houses sighed like tired beasts. The people begged for mercy, but mercy never came. Instead, fear grew until every footstep felt like it was walking on bones, and every breath felt borrowed from the land itself. And Eleanor, sitting on her porch in the darkness, whispered again that the land does not release what it has claimed, and soon the reckoning would rise from below. The neighborhood was drowning in fear and silence, and no family felt safe anymore, because their homes had become cages and the streets had turned into endless circles. And yet among them, there were still a few who believed that answers could be found if they dared to face the woman at the edge of the land, the woman who had warned them all but had never spoken fully. One evening, a young couple named David and Mariah decided to go to Eleanor's house. Though terror pressed heavy on their hearts, they walked with lanterns in hand, moving past the rows of houses that seemed to watch them with dark, like windows, like hollow eyes. The air was thick, and every step echoed as if the ground itself was listening. When they reached Eleanor's porch, she was already waiting, her silver braid catching faint light, her cane resting firmly against the floor, and her eyes glowing with calm fire. David spoke first, his voice trembling but strong, asking what was happening to the neighborhood. What curse had been awakened, and how they could stop it? Eleanor studied them in silence for a long moment. Then she sighed deeply and motioned them inside. Her wooden house smelled of herbs, old wood and smoke, and on the walls hung faded portraits of people who looked stern and proud, their eyes carrying the same fire as hers. She led them to a table where several journals lay bound in leather and marked with strange symbols, and she opened one with hands steady as stone. Inside were sketches, maps, and pages written in dark ink, telling stories of chains, iron doors, and oaths of vengeance. Eleanor said, "My grandmother gave me these journals. She told me to protect the land, for it is alive and it remembers everything, every wound, every betrayal." She explained that the iron doors buried under the houses were not random. They were the sealed graves of the 96 men who had been chained and abandoned, and their spirits had sworn to remain till justice was done. The HOA in its greed had built 96 homes above them, each house sitting upon a prison, each family unknowingly sleeping above chains and bones. Mariah clutched her husband's arm, her voice shaking as she asked why the spirits were now rising. Eleanor's eyes grew darker, and she said, "Because the seal has been broken, every hammer, every nail, every foundation pressed against the doors and stirred the restless ones awake. Now they seek release, and they seek revenge." David demanded to know if there was any way to calm them or to undo what had been done. Eleanor looked at him sadly and said, "The curse is not mine to break. It belongs to the land itself. I can speak with the spirits, but I cannot command them. They do not listen to words. They listen to balance, and they listen to bladas." She spoke. A low rumble shook the floor, and the lantern flickered, shadows stretching across the walls, and the couple felt the air grow heavy. Like chains wrapping around their lungs, Eleanor remained calm, her cane tapping. 3 times against the wood in a rhythm that made the rumble fade away, she said, "They are always listening, even now." She revealed then a final truth that no one had yet heard. She said, "Each house is a door, and each family is a key the land has chosen. Them not by chance, but by design. The HOA thought they controlled this place, but they were only players in a game older than memory, David." And Mariah sat frozen, their hearts racing and their minds screaming to run, but they could not move, for the weight of her words chained them tighter than iron. And Eleanor leaned closer, whispering, "You cannot escape. You can only endure, or you can surrender. The land will decide which path you walk." When they left her house that night, the wind followed them, carrying faint whispers like voices from underground, and as they entered their home, the floor creaked louder than before, as if welcoming them into the waiting trap hand. On her porch, Eleanor sat once again, her eyes fixed on the 96 glowing. Windows whispering softly, the doors are opening, and the reckoning has only begun. The night of reckoning arrived without warning, and the neighborhood that once glowed with bright porch lights and laughter now trembled under a sky heavy with black clouds. The air pressed down like iron, and silence held every street until midnight, when the silence broke into a roar from the ground families. Woke to the sound of chains dragging across floors, though no one had opened a door, they rushed to windows and saw the earth splitting in thin lines under their yards, and the cracks glowed faint red as if fire slept beneath. The soil children screamed that men were climbing out of the dark, and when parents tried to comfort them, they too saw shadows rise from the ground. The first to appear were tall figures wrapped in chains, their bodies black as smoke, yet solid enough to shake the earth with each step. Their faces were hollow, their eyes burning with red light, and their voices a mix of wind and thunder. They moved slowly, yet no wall and no lock could keep them out, for chains slid through windows, doors, and even floors, pulling aside everything that stood in their path. Panic spread as families tried to flee, but the same endless trap caught them again. The cars failed, the roads twisted back, and every turn returned them to their own homes. So they were forced to watch as the spirits spread across the 96 houses, and each shadow claimed the ground beneath its door. In the community hall, the HOA leaders had gathered, desperate to find answers. But before they could speak, the floor burst open, and a chain wrapped around the chairman's legs. Dragging him screaming into the crack, the others ran, but chains followed, striking walls, shattering windows, wrapping around throats, and pulling the guilty into the soil one by one. The board vanished, leaving only silence and the smell of rusted iron. Eleanor stood on her porch, calm and unmoving, her cane pressed into the wood as she chanted the words of her grandmother. Her voice rising above the screams, she called to the spirits, saying, "Remember balance. Remember oath. Take what was promised, but do not harm the innocent." Yet the land was old and heavy, and it did not listen. Easily some families were spared as the chains passed through their rooms without touch, but others were not so fortunate, for guilt ran deep, not only in the leaders but also in those who had laughed at Eleanor, mocked her warnings, and signed papers that erased her claim. Those houses shook violently, walls cracked, and roofs bent as chains coiled tight around them, pulling them closer to the ground as if swallowing them. Mariah and David clung to each other, watching their walls tremble, their lantern flicker, and their floor creak as if the door below was straining to open. They remembered Eleanor's words that each family was a key, and they feared that the land had chosen them. But suddenly the rumble slowed, their lantern steadied, and though chains scraped outside their window, they did not enter their home that night. Across the street another family screamed as their door burst inward, and shadows dragged the father into darkness. The mother begged for mercy, clutching her child, but only silence answered as the floor sealed again, leaving nothing but dust in an empty room. By dawn, the neighborhood looked broken, lawns torn, streets cracked, windows shattered, and houses leaning like old bones. Yet worse than the damage was the silence, for many doors no longer opened, and many windows no longer held faces. The people realized that entire families had vanished, and only their empty homes remained standing like gravestones. Eleanor whispered to the wind that the reckoning had begun, and that the land had only taken its first breath. She knew the night was not the end, but the beginning, and that the true weight of the oath was yet to fall, and her eyes glowed with sorrow and fire as she said, "The innocent may still be spared, but the guilty will all be claimed before the chain is complete."